At 75, I had lived a life full of love, hardship, and quiet resilience. I had raised children, buried loved ones, celebrated small victories, and endured disappointments, but nothing prepared me for the day my daughter's husband, David, looked me straight in the eye and demanded what was mine. It began like any other morning. I had woken early, brewed a cup of tea, and was flipping through an old photo album, smiling at the memories of my grandchildren when a knock on the door interrupted my peaceful solitude. I opened it to find David leaning against the frame, his arms crossed, a smirk playing across his face, as if he were about to deliver some joke. "We're short on rent," he said casually, as though discussing the weather. "Give us your pension or leave." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. My pension, the money I had worked for decades to earn, the money that gave me the ability to live independently, was suddenly the target of my own family's greed. I felt a rush of disbelief, followed by an icy wave of betrayal. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "You want me to hand over my pension to cover your rent?" "Yes," he said simply, as though that answered everything. "Either you give it to us or you're out. Your choice." I looked past him to my daughter, hoping for some sign of support, but her eyes were downcast. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She had chosen her husband over me, over the woman who had raised her, fed her, and carried her through every heartbreak. That realization hit me harder than any insult. The woman who once clung to my side in times of fear and joy had turned her back on me. I drew in a deep breath, steadying myself. "No," I said finally, my voice firmer now. "I will not give you my pension. That money is mine. It has been my lifeline, and I refuse to let it be stolen under threat." David's smirk widened, as though my refusal was amusing. "You're being difficult," he said. "You've always been difficult. Maybe it's time you faced reality." Then, without another word, they left. But they didn't simply walk away. They left my life in fragments. My bags were placed on the porch, thrown roughly, as though my 75 years of memories could be reduced to a pile of belongings. Clothes, books, photo albums, mementos of birthdays, graduations, and anniversaries, all tossed without care, exposed to the cold morning air. I stood there, staring at the heap of my life, feeling a pain deeper than physical injury. The sting of betrayal by those I had loved most. A surge of helplessness threatened to overwhelm me, but I refused to succumb. I gathered my scattered belongings with meticulous care, treating each item as a testament to the life I had lived, the strength I had built. I would not let them see me broken. I would not give them the satisfaction. As I arranged my belongings back into order, a thought began to crystallize, a quiet, simmering determination. I may be 75, but I was far from powerless. Life had taught me resilience, patience, and cunning. I had survived loss, heartbreak, and disappointment, and I had always found a way to rise again. David and my daughter had underestimated me. They had assumed that age equated to weakness, that a pension was an easy target. But I was no fool, and I had no intention of allowing them to exploit me. Their betrayal had lit a fire within me, a determination that would not be extinguished. I realized that revenge, if it were to be truly satisfying, could not be hasty or rash. It would need to be deliberate, patient, and precise. I would make them understand, through actions not words, that the person they had wronged was not helpless, and that betrayal comes with consequences. That morning, standing on my porch with the cold wind brushing against my face, I made a silent vow. They may have left me with nothing but my bags and memories, but they would soon learn that dignity, patience, and intelligence are far more valuable than money. And I, the woman they had dismissed and humiliated, would ensure that their arrogance was met with a reckoning they would never forget. Starting over at 75 is not easy. People assume that at my age, the world becomes smaller, that opportunities shrink and doors close. But as I stepped into the small apartment I had managed to rent, bare, quiet, but mine, I realized that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a life rebuilt not out of dependence, but dignity. The apartment wasn't much. The walls were plain, the kitchen old, and the furniture mismatched, but I arranged everything with careful intention. I unpacked my belongings slowly, smoothing each piece of clothing, setting framed photographs on the shelves, placing my favorite cup near the kettle. Every item I arranged was a reminder that although I had been thrown out, I was not defeated. My hands trembled occasionally, not from weakness, but from the simmering determination that had replaced my grief. The first few days were quiet. Lonely, yes, but peaceful. I spent the mornings sipping tea by the window, observing the world outside. Children heading to school, neighbors leaving for work, couples arguing about trivial things. Life continued as usual, indifferent to my pain. Yet I found comfort in the normalcy. Pain, after all, does not pause the world. And neither should I. By the second week, I forced myself to step out. I visited the local library, a place I hadn't been to in years. The dusty smell of old books, the silence between shelves. It was soothing in a way I didn't expect. I sat at a computer, staring at the screen for a long moment before gathering the courage to start. I researched small business consulting, financial management, and updated myself on the new technology that had emerged since I last worked. My mind, though aged, was sharp. Numbers still made sense to me. Contracts still felt familiar. Decades ago, before I became a full-time mother, I had been the one people relied on to read fine print, to calculate budgets, to negotiate deals. It was a skill set I had buried under family responsibilities, but now, I needed it more than ever. I began offering my help quietly. A shopkeeper down the street needed assistance sorting his monthly expenses. A beauty salon owner needed help calculating profit margins. A young couple who ran a grocery store needed guidance on organizing inventory. Word spread slowly, first as whispers, then as requests. I never bragged. I never talked about my betrayal. I simply did what I had always done. I worked with honesty, precision, and dedication. And people appreciated it. They trusted me. They paid me fairly. With each passing week, I earned enough to cover my needs, and more. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. It was control. Yet even as I rebuilt my life, I kept an eye on my daughter and her husband from a distance. I didn't stalk them or follow them obsessively. But news travels quickly in small neighborhoods, and people talk more than they realize. I heard whispers, late rent, unpaid bills, rising arguments. David's arrogance had begun to crumble under the weight of his own irresponsibility. I didn't celebrate their downfall, not yet. But I watched. I listened. And slowly, a plan began to form. Not fueled by spite, but by justice. If life had taught me anything, it was that the most effective revenge is not loud or messy. It is precise, calculated, and delivered at the perfect moment. Every mistake they made added to my quiet strategy. Every unpaid bill, every delayed payment, every argument. They had tossed me out as though I were a burden, but they were the ones now sinking under financial pressure they couldn't handle. I spent my nights documenting everything I learned, dates, debts, patterns. Not out of obsession, but out of preparation. They had relied on my pension once. Now unknowingly, they were building the foundation of their own downfall. By the end of the second month, my life had transformed. I no longer woke up with the sting of betrayal. I woke with purpose. My apartment felt warm, lived in. My income, though modest, was steady. And in the quiet moments of reflection, I realized something powerful. They had tried to break me. Instead, they had awakened me. By the third month, I had settled fully into my new routine. My mornings were spent reviewing financial statements for local businesses, afternoons walking through the quiet streets, and evenings organizing the notes I had taken about my daughter and David's affairs. Every small detail mattered. Every mistake, every misstep, every lapse in judgment would become part of the web I was carefully weaving. I did not rush my plan. Patience had been my ally for decades. I had learned that impulsive action rarely brings the satisfaction one hopes for, especially when dealing with those who underestimate your experience. David and my daughter had assumed I was weak, vulnerable, and forgetful. They had no idea that in my age and seeming frailty lay years of wisdom, cunning, and resilience. The first step was observation. I paid attention to their habits, their spending patterns, and the small cracks in their otherwise confident facade. They argued often, sometimes loudly enough that neighbors overheard. Their creditors were patient at first, but even the most lenient landlord eventually grows tired. I began to compile a mental record. Overdue payments, late notices, careless decisions, and the arrogance with which they assumed no one noticed. Next came the subtle interventions. I started attending local community meetings, not as an observer, but as a quiet participant. There I met business owners, local lawyers, and neighbors who knew them. I asked questions, offered casual advice, and listened more than I spoke. No one suspected that I was gathering information not for myself, but for a carefully orchestrated purpose. The irony was sweet. I, the woman they had discarded, now had the upper hand, slowly knitting together the strands of their downfall. During this time, my own life flourished quietly. My consulting work expanded, and my reputation grew. People admired my knowledge, my attention to detail, and my calm wisdom. I was no longer the frail old woman they had pushed to the porch. I had become a presence to be respected. Every day, I felt the confidence and strength building within me, a quiet power that I had long forgotten I possessed. The real turning point came when I learned of a particularly careless decision David had made regarding their landlord. They had ignored repeated warnings about late rent, and were on the brink of eviction. This was the moment I had been preparing for, not out of malice, but as the inevitable consequence of their own arrogance. I began to position myself strategically. Through careful networking, I subtly let the landlord know that there was a reliable, trustworthy alternative who could ensure rent payments and stability. The message was quiet, indirect, but effective. David and my daughter remained unaware of my influence, blind to the fact that the woman they had thought powerless was now quietly controlling the situation. Simultaneously, I strengthened my own financial position. I opened a small account in my name, separate from anything they could access. I ensured that I had resources to not just survive, but to act decisively when the time came. Every dollar earned felt like a piece of armor. Every client interaction a reminder that I was no longer dependent on those who had betrayed me. And all the while, I nurtured the sweetest part of my plan, waiting. Revenge, I realized, is most effective when it is unexpected. When the moment arrives, it should strike not with anger, but with the calm inevitability of justice. David and my daughter had rushed me once, assuming their threats would work. Now I was the one with the patience, the foresight, and the quiet power. I no longer woke in fear or sadness. I woke with purpose. Each morning, as the sun rose over my small apartment, I reminded myself, betrayal is not an ending, it is an opportunity. And opportunity, when paired with wisdom and patience, yields the sweetest revenge. By the time the 4th month rolled around, the tide had quietly turned. My daughter and David were teetering on the edge of a crisis they had brought upon themselves, blind to the fact that I, the woman they had discarded, was now orchestrating the balance of power. I didn't rush in. There was no need. Patience had been my ally, and timing, as always, would be my weapon. The first sign of change came subtly. Their landlord, frustrated with repeated late payments and unreturned calls, reached out to me discreetly. I had established a reputation as reliable and trustworthy with a few business owners, and now that trust extended to those in positions of authority. Through quiet negotiation, I offered a solution that ensured the rent would be covered, but under terms that placed me in a position of control. The irony was exquisite. The couple who had demanded my pension, as if it were theirs, were now in a position of dependence I had long foreseen. I didn't gloat, at least not outwardly. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no public humiliation. True satisfaction, I had learned, is quiet and unassailable. Over the following weeks, I watched as their financial recklessness collided with my carefully laid plans. Missed deadlines, arguments over bills, and panic over late notices became frequent. They scrambled, flustered and unaware, while I navigated the situation with calm precision. Every misstep they made reinforced the inevitability of the outcome I had designed. Then came the decisive moment. One evening, David stormed into my apartment uninvited, rage in his eyes, demanding to know why I had interfered with their rent situation. My daughter followed silently, shame written across her face. I stood, steady and composed, holding a cup of tea as though nothing were amiss. I didn't interfere, I said, my voice calm, measured. I merely ensured that obligations were met. You assumed that I was powerless. You assumed that age made me weak. You were wrong. They stared at me, mouths open, unable to respond. For a moment, silence reigned. I felt a wave of satisfaction. Not from cruelty, but from justice. The power dynamics had shifted. I was no longer the one who depended on their whims. They were the ones now beholden to the rules I had quietly set. I handed my daughter a folder I had prepared. Inside were clear records of their unpaid bills, missed deadlines, and evidence of their financial negligence. I had documented everything meticulously, not to humiliate, but to teach a lesson they could not ignore. These are the consequences of choices made in arrogance, I said softly. You cannot disregard others without accountability. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, she looked at me with genuine respect and fear. David, once smug and entitled, realized the gravity of his errors. There were no angry words exchanged. The weight of understanding hung between us. They had learned, the hard way, that betrayal has consequences. After they left, quiet returned to my apartment. I poured myself a cup of tea, settling into my favorite chair, surrounded by the carefully arranged belongings I had saved from the porch. A sense of peace washed over me. I had defended my dignity, reclaimed my independence, and delivered justice. Not through aggression, but through patience, intelligence, and courage. At 75, I had faced betrayal and emerged victorious. I had proven, first to myself, and then to them, that strength does not diminish with age, and that wisdom paired with perseverance can turn even the deepest wounds into triumphs. Sweet revenge had been mine, not loud, not vengeful in spectacle, but precise, deserved, and utterly satisfying. And as the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting a golden glow across my small apartment, I realized something profound. Life had tested me, but I had emerged not broken, but triumphant. The porch of betrayal had become the foundation for my victory.